You know what's wild about history? Sometimes the greatest empires aren't built by visionaries with master plans. Sometimes they're born from complete chaos, from the ashes of someone else's empire that got absolutely demolished. And I'm talking about one of the most ironic twists in all of human history. Picture this. It's June 26th, 1243. Dawn breaks over a mountain pass in eastern Anatolia called Köse Dağ. The air is already thick with summer heat, and dust hangs like a golden veil over two armies preparing to collide. On one side, 80,000 men, Seljuk Turks, Byzantine mercenaries, Georgian knights, Arab warriors. The combined might of the civilized Islamic world in Anatolia. Their armor glints like scattered jewels across the valley. Their numbers seem overwhelming, unstoppable. On the other side, 30,000 Mongol horsemen, outnumbered nearly 3-1. Most people would look at those odds and think the Mongols were doomed. Those people would be catastrophically wrong. Because what happened on that mountain pass didn't just decide a battle. It didn't just end an empire. It accidentally created one of the greatest powers in human history. An empire that would conquer Constantinople, terrify Europe for centuries, and reshape 3 continents. And the Mongols, the guys who won this fight, they had absolutely no idea what they were setting in motion. This is the story of how destruction creates opportunity, how chaos breeds power, how the Mongols came to Anatolia to establish order, and instead shattered everything so completely that it gave birth to the Ottoman Empire. The battle nobody remembers created the empire nobody could forget. Before we dive into this insane story, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Trust me, you're going to want to catch the next video, because history is full of these wild domino effects, and we're just getting started. Seriously, subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is going to blow your mind. This story has everything. Massive armies, catastrophic defeats, political intrigue, and consequences that lasted 6 centuries. All right, let's go back to 1243 and watch an empire die so another could be born. The stakes? Everything. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum wasn't just another kingdom. It was the bridge between East and West, the anchor of Islamic civilization in Anatolia, the gateway controlling trade routes worth fortunes. Lose this battle, lose this empire, and you don't just lose land. You lose order itself. You unleash chaos. And chaos, as it turns out, is exactly what the world needed for the Ottomans to rise. To understand how spectacularly everything fell apart, you need to know what was about to break. And I mean really understand it. Because the Seljuk Sultanate wasn't some weak, declining state waiting to collapse. This was a powerhouse, and what happened to it should terrify anyone who thinks empires are permanent. For nearly 2 centuries, the Seljuk Turks had been the undisputed masters of Anatolia. Ever since that legendary victory at Manzikert in 1071, when they crushed the Byzantine Empire and sent the Greeks reeling back to Constantinople, the Seljuks had ruled this land like kings. Their Sultanate of Rum meaning Rome, because they saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Roman Anatolia, was prosperous, sophisticated, powerful. Cities like Konya and Sivas thrived, with populations in the tens of thousands. Merchants grew rich on Silk Road trade, moving Chinese silk and Indian spices through Anatolian markets. Poets composed verses in Persian that are still read today. Architects built monuments, mosques, madrasas, caravanserais that still stand, beautiful and haunting, testament to a civilization at its peak. The Sultan in 1243 was a man named Kaikhosru II, and he was everything a medieval ruler shouldn't be. Young, impulsive, convinced of his own invincibility. He'd inherited a stable kingdom from his careful diplomatic father, Kaikubad I. His father had understood how to navigate the dangerous waters of 13th century geopolitics, pay tribute when necessary, fight when advantageous, never provoke enemies you can't defeat. Kaikhosru II had inherited his father's throne. He hadn't inherited his father's wisdom. He was about to inherit a catastrophe of his own making. Because to the east, beyond the mountains, beyond the plateau, a shadow had been growing for years. The Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan was dead by 1243. He died back in 1227. But his legacy was very much alive, and it was hungry. His generals had already conquered Persia, devastated Central Asia, and turned the great Khwarezmian Empire into a memory and a warning. The stories that filtered back to Anatolia from those conquests were the stuff of nightmares. Cities besieged and destroyed, populations slaughtered wholesale or enslaved, pyramids of skulls left as monuments to Mongol power. Entire dynasties erased from history. The Mongols reached Anatolia's borders in the 1230s. At first, the relationship was almost cordial, in that careful way that predator and prey can coexist when the predator isn't hungry yet. The Seljuks paid modest tribute, some gold, some silk, some horses. They sent gifts. They acknowledged Mongol supremacy in that careful diplomatic language that lets everyone save face while avoiding actual submission. The Mongol general in the region, a man named Chormakan, seemed content with this arrangement. He had bigger concerns, conquering Georgia, subduing Armenia, consolidating Mongol control over the Caucasus. Peace, however uneasy, held. But Kaikhosru II didn't want peace. Or maybe he didn't understand what he was risking by breaking it. Or maybe, and this is probably closest to the truth, he was surrounded by advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, rather than what he needed to know. When Chormakan died in 1241, his replacement was a general named Baiju Noyan, and Baiju was done with diplomatic niceties. The great Khan Urgedei had died in 1241 as well, and in the power vacuum that followed, Mongol commanders in the field had more autonomy. Baiju looked at the situation in Anatolia and decided it was time to make the Seljuks truly submit, not just with tribute, but with absolute, humiliating obedience that left no doubt who the masters were. His demands were crystal clear and deliberately insulting. Kaikhosru had to travel to Mongolia in person to pay homage to the great Khan, not send an ambassador, go himself across thousands of miles, prostrate himself before Mongol authority. He had to send hostages, princes of the blood, to guarantee good behavior. And he had to accept Mongol officials called Daragachi into his court to oversee tax collection and ensure compliance. These administrators would have veto power over Seljuk decisions. They would control the purse strings. They would report everything back to the Mongol capital. These weren't requests, they were commands. And Kaikhosru, surrounded by young nobles as hot-headed as himself, made a catastrophically stupid decision that would doom his empire and everyone in it. He refused. Flat out, unequivocally refused. Maybe he thought the Mongols were overextended. After all, they were fighting in China, in Russia, in Persia. How much attention could they possibly give to Anatolia? Maybe he believed his own propaganda about Seljuk military might. His father had won battles, expanded the Sultanate's borders. Maybe he was just too proud to bend the knee, too young to understand that pride is a luxury empires can't always afford. Whatever his reasoning, he picked a fight with the most lethal military machine on the planet. Baiju's response was methodical and terrifying. In the winter of 1242, his army appeared before the walls of Erzurum, a major city in eastern Anatolia, one of the Sultanate's most important strongholds. He sent envoys with a simple message: surrender or be destroyed. The governor of Erzurum, a man named Yakut, who had more courage than sense, didn't just refuse. He insulted the Mongol ambassadors to their faces, mocked them, sent them away with threats. Big mistake. Huge, fatal mistake. The Mongols besieged Erzurum with 12 catapults, massive siege engines that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They pounded the walls day and night, methodically, patiently, while simultaneously cutting off all supplies to the city. In 2 months, just 60 days, the city fell. What happened next was a message written in blood, a lesson taught in screams that echoed across Anatolia. The population was slaughtered, not just soldiers, but civilians, men, women, children. The Mongols wanted to make an example. Buildings were razed, churches and mosques alike were torn down, their treasures looted. The city that had stood for centuries became a smoking ruin. Survivors who fled carried stories of Mongol cruelty that made children cry and warriors pale. Then, having made their point, having demonstrated exactly what defiance would cost, Baiju withdrew. Not because he was afraid, because he was patient. He returned to winter quarters in the Mugan plain and waited. He knew Kaikhosro would have to respond. He knew the Sultan's pride wouldn't let this stand. And he knew that when the armies finally met, the outcome was already decided. The Seljuks just didn't know it yet. Kaikhosro, to his credit, understood the magnitude of the threat. He sent messengers racing across Anatolia and beyond, calling for aid. This wasn't just a Seljuk problem anymore. This was an existential threat to every Muslim power in the region. He needed allies, and fast. And they came. The Empire of Trebizond, that Byzantine remnant clinging to the Black Sea coast, sent troops. The Ayyubid Sultan in Aleppo, ruling over Syria, dispatched warriors, Frankish mercenaries, Christian knights who fought for gold rather than God, joined the muster, their plate armour and war horses a welcome addition. Georgian nobles, bound by marriage alliances to the Seljuk royal family, rode to war with their heavy cavalry. Even the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, Manuel II, offered encouraging words, if not actual soldiers. He couldn't spare troops, but he could send prayers and diplomatic support. By spring 1243, Kaikhosro had assembled something truly impressive. 80,000 men, the largest army ever gathered in Anatolia. This wasn't some hastily assembled levy of peasants with farming tools. This was a professional, multinational coalition. Turkic cavalry, the core of Seljuk military power, formed the centre. These were skilled horsemen with composite bows, veterans of border warfare. Infantry from various beyliks, those semi-autonomous Turkish principalities, swelled the ranks. The Frankish knights brought their devastating charges, the shock tactics that had won battles from Jerusalem to Antioch. The Georgians brought discipline and training. The Ayyubid Arabs brought desert fighting experience, a knowledge of facing steppe nomads. It was a coalition of the willing, united by fear of what would happen if the Mongols won. But coalitions have a fatal weakness. They don't share a language, a culture, or a command structure. Kaikhosro's army spoke a dozen tongues. Orders had to be translated, retranslated, sometimes guessed at. Some contingents owed loyalty to the Sultan. Others were mercenaries who'd switch sides if the money was better elsewhere. And the Turkmen tribal cavalry, fierce fighters all, had more in common culturally with the Mongols than with the urbanized Seljuks they supposedly served. Somewhere in those highlands, in one of those minor beyliks that had sent troops to the muster, was a family we should mention. A man named Erzurum, leader of a small Kai tribe, probably sent warriors to this gathering. His holdings were modest, a few villages, some grazing land near a place called Surt on the Byzantine frontier. Nobody paid him much attention. Why would they? He was nobody important. His tribe numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. He held no great cities, controlled no trade routes. His grandson would be named Osman, and Osman would change the world. But in June 1243, the future was unwritten. The present was all that mattered. And the present was about to become a bloodbath that would echo through centuries. The armies converged on a landscape that seemed designed by the gods to humble human ambition and mock human planning. Köse Dağ, the name means beardless mountain in Turkish, was a narrow pass east of Sivas, threading through highlands where summer heat turned the air to liquid copper and water sources were scarce as mercy. To the north, mountains rose in brown ridges, stark and beautiful, and utterly indifferent to the men about to die in their shadows. To the south, more mountains. Through the middle, a valley just wide enough for armies to maneuver, just narrow enough for clever generals to exploit. The terrain was classic cavalry country, open enough for horsemen to operate, but with enough broken ground to create opportunities for ambush and maneuver. This terrain mattered more than most soldiers realized. In open steppe, the Mongols were unstoppable. Their cavalry could wheel and feint and envelop with room to spare, executing those devastating tactics that had conquered half the world. In mountain passes, that advantage diminished. Disciplined infantry could hold choke points. Heavy cavalry could charge down valleys and crush lighter horsemen against the slopes. Defenders with good positions could negate numerical disadvantages. Or so Kai Khosrow's generals argued. The smart ones, the experienced Atabegs who'd spent decades fighting on these borderlands, who'd survived battles that killed lesser men, these veterans advocated for a defensive strategy. Let them come to us at Sivas, they urged. We have walls, water, supplies. Make them besiegers. Let them waste time and men on our defences. Stretch their logistics. Wait for summer heat to do what our swords cannot. Force them to attack on our terms, not theirs. It was sound advice, the kind of advice that wins wars, that saves empires, that makes commanders immortal in history books. Kai Khosrow ignored it. The Sultan's younger advisers, nobles who'd never faced the Mongols, who'd heard stories but never smelled burning cities or seen populations marched into slavery, these men wanted glory. They wanted a decisive battle, a crushing victory, a triumph that would be sung about for generations. They wanted to prove that Seljuk warriors were superior to these steppe barbarians, that civilization and faith would triumph over nomadic raiders. They took only one of our cities, Kai Khosrow reportedly said. Erzurum is one city among many. I have dozens of cities. We will meet them in the field and destroy them where they stand. Pride speaking. Arrogance. The kind of hubris that makes historians wince when they read the sources centuries later. So the Seljuk army marched out from Konya, the capital, in late May. 80,000 men on the move is a logistical nightmare, that would challenge modern militaries with trucks and radios. For medieval armies, it was an almost insurmountable challenge. The column stretched for miles. Accounts suggest it took most of a day for the entire army to pass a given point. Cavalry rode ahead, scouting and foraging. Infantry trudged in the centre, feet blistering in the heat, armour weighing heavier with each step. Baggage trains creaked along in the rear with supplies and camp followers, merchants, prostitutes, cooks, servants, all the human detritus that medieval armies accumulated. The army ate its way through the countryside like a locust swarm, requisitioning food from villages, paying when they remembered, taking when they didn't. Local populations watched the Sultan's host march by with mixed emotions. Relief that these troops weren't staying, fear of what would happen if they lost, hope that maybe the Mongol threat would finally be eliminated. They covered roughly 320 kilometers in stages, marching for a few hours each morning before the heat became unbearable, resting through the afternoon, marching again in the evening. It took weeks. By late June, they'd reached the approaches to Köse Dağ and found it empty. Beju had gotten there first, but he'd withdrawn. His scouts had been watching the Seljuk advance for days, shadowing the columns from the hills, counting numbers, noting composition, reporting everything back to their general. When Khosrow's vanguard reached the pass on June 25th, they found Mongol campfires still warm, horse droppings fresh, but no army. Some of the Sultan's men celebrated. "They fled!" went the cry through the camp. "They saw our numbers and ran like dogs! The great Mongols are cowards after all!" The smart generals knew better. Mongols didn't flee. They manoeuvred, they positioned, they chose ground. And somewhere out there, just beyond visual range, 30,000 Mongol cavalry were preparing a trap. That night, the last night before the battle, the two armies camped within a few miles of each other, though the Seljuks didn't know exactly where their enemy had positioned. In Khosrow's camp, the atmosphere was strange, electric with tension and false confidence. Some men prayed, performing the rituals that had sustained soldiers for centuries. Muslims faced Mecca and whispered verses from the Quran, asking Allah for strength and victory. Christians among the mercenaries made the sign of the cross and commended their souls to God. Georgians sang low hymns in their guttural language, songs of faith and battle that had been old when their grandfathers were young. Others drank. The Frankish knights especially drained wineskins and boasted about what they'd do to the Mongols tomorrow. They'd faced horse archers before in the Crusades, or so they claimed. "Just ride them down," the knights said, voices loud with wine and bravado. "Once we close the distance, their bows are useless. They can't stand against a proper charge. We'll scatter them like chaff." They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. In the Mongol camp, the mood was different, quiet, professional, almost serene. Silence reigned, broken only by the sounds of preparation. These were professional soldiers who'd campaigned from Hungary to Korea, who'd seen more battles than most men see sunrises. They didn't need motivational speeches or appeals to courage. They knew their business like craftsmen know their tools. They checked their bowstrings in the firelight, testing tension, replacing any that showed wear. They ran whetstones along their sabres, the distinctive curved blades that could take a man's head off with one swing. They adjusted the leather armor plates, lamella armor, overlapping scales that provided surprising protection while maintaining flexibility, that covered their bodies from neck to knee. Each warrior carried 60 arrows in 2 quivers, 30 on each hip. Each arrow had been inspected that evening. Each bow had been tested. Each horse had been checked for lameness, fed and watered. Baiju walked among his men, speaking quietly with his commanders, men who'd served with him for years, who could anticipate his orders before he gave them. The plan was simple. Mongol plans always were. Simplicity works in the chaos of battle when complicated schemes fall apart. Let the enemy attack. Use mobility to avoid their charges. Shoot them to pieces with arrows from beyond their reach. When they break, and they will break, pursue and destroy without mercy. 30,000 warriors against 80,000 sounded like madness to anyone who didn't understand how the Mongols fought. But these men had conquered half the known world with these tactics. They'd destroyed armies twice, 3 times their size. Numbers didn't intimidate them. Numbers just meant more targets, more bodies to add to the count, more proof of Mongol superiority. The Mongol force composition was brutally efficient, honed by decades of conquest. The core was heavy cavalry, men in lamella armor on armored horses, carrying composite bows, sabers and lances. These weren't the lightly armored steppe raiders of popular imagination, the horse barbarians from movies. These were shock troops who could shoot from horseback at full gallop with devastating accuracy, and also charge home in close combat like European knights. Supporting them were lighter horse archers, less armoured but faster, more agile, used for harassment and pursuit. They'd sweep around enemy flanks, pepper them with arrows, retreat when threatened, return when the enemy tired. Mongol battles were marathons of manoeuvre, not sprints of heroic charges. And then there were the auxiliaries, Armenian and Georgian contingents who'd been conquered years earlier and now fought for their Mongol masters. These Christians knew the terrain, spoke the languages, and provided useful intelligence. They also served as expendable shock troops when needed, absorbing casualties that preserved Mongol core units. The Mongols also had a psychological weapon the Seljuks couldn't match: experience and absolute confidence born from that experience. Every man in Baiju's army had fought in multiple campaigns. They'd besieged cities, crossed deserts, survived winters that killed horses and weak men. They'd seen their tactics work again and again and again. They didn't doubt. They didn't fear. They didn't question. They just waited for the killing to start. Professional as butchers waiting for livestock. Kaikhosro's army, in contrast, was a grab bag of different military traditions that had never trained together, that barely spoke the same language, that had competing ideas about how battles should be fought. The Turkic cavalry fought in a style similar to the Mongols, but less refined, less coordinated, less disciplined. They were good, but the Mongols were better. The infantry levies from the Beyliks were barely trained peasants with spears, brave enough but lacking the skill to stand against professional cavalry. The Frankish knights were brave and skilled but rigid, locked into Western European tactics of frontal charges that worked great against other knights but had weaknesses against mobile horse archers. The Georgians were excellent, probably the best troops in the Seljuk army, but few in number. The Ayyubid Arabs were used to desert warfare, not mountain passes, and commanding this polyglot force was a sultan who'd never fought the Mongols, surrounded by advisors who confused enthusiasm with expertise, who mistook numbers for strength, who thought courage could substitute for strategy. As dawn approached on June 26th, the temperature was already climbing. This would be a hot day, the kind of brutal Anatolian summer heat that makes armor burn skin, that makes men desperate for water, that turns minor wounds into fatal infections, that kills as surely as swords. The sky lightened from black to grey to pale blue. In the Seljuk camp, horns began to blow. Different horns for different contingents, creating a cacophony rather than a symphony. Commanders shouted orders in multiple languages: Turkish, Arabic, Georgian, Greek, Latin. Men scrambled to form ranks, to find their units, to ready weapons and horses. The confusion was immense, but somehow the army began to organize itself, drawn up in rough formations across the valley floor. Khosrow called a final council just after sunrise. His generals gathered around him in the command tent, a space thick with tension and competing egos. The conservative Atabegs made one last plea. "Lord, we should hold our position. Let them come to us. We have the numbers to form a defensive line they cannot break. We can wear them down, force them to attack fortified positions, make them pay in blood for every yard of ground." The young nobles shouted them down with the confidence of men who'd never seen battle. "We came here to fight. Are we cowards who hide behind walls? The men will think we're afraid. We have 80,000 warriors. We'll crush these barbarians and send their survivors running back to Mongolia." Khosrow made his decision, the decision that would doom an empire. "We attack. Today. We'll drive them back to wherever they came from and teach them that Anatolia belongs to the Seljuks, now and forever." The die was cast. The decision was made. There would be no turning back now. The army began to move, a great beast of men and horses and steel, stumbling forward toward its own destruction. And in the Mongol camp, scouts watched through the morning haze and reported to Beju with professional detachment. "They're coming. They're coming in disorder, with no proper formation. Their line is ragged. Their flanks are exposed." Beju smiled, a thin smile that never reached his eyes. This would be easier than he thought. "Position the men," he ordered. "Let them come. Let them tire themselves marching in the heat. Then we'll show them what happens when amateurs face professionals." The Seljuk army advanced toward the pass, where they expected to find the Mongols. Instead, they found them on rising ground to the northeast, already formed for battle, waiting with that terrible Mongol patience that had conquered empires. It was time. Time for 80,000 men to learn that numbers meant nothing. Time for an empire to die. Time for history to turn on its axis. The sound came first, before the violence, before the blood, before the world came apart at the seams. A low thunder of 80,000 men moving forward, metal jangling against metal, horses snorting clouds of steam in the morning air, boots crushing dry grass that crunched like breaking bones. The smell followed, dust and sweat, and the acrid tang of fear, barely masked by perfume and bravado. Leather heated by sun, the organic reek of men packed too close together, horse dung and human waste, and the oil used to maintain weapons. And then the visual. Two armies spreading across a valley floor like storms about to collide, banners rippling in hot wind, sunlight catching on tens of thousands of spear points and sword blades, until the whole Seljuk line glittered like a river of steel flowing toward its fate. The Mongols waited on higher ground, motionless as statues carved from stone. 30,000 horsemen, in precise formations, not a wasted movement, not a sound beyond horses stamping and the occasional jingle of harness. Their composite bows were strung and ready. Their quivers were full, each man carrying 60 arrows that would soon darken the sky. Their discipline was absolute, inhuman. terrifying to anyone who understood what it meant. Kai Khusraw sat his horse in the center of the Seljuk line, surrounded by his personal guard in their finest armor, men who'd sworn to die for their sultan, who'd soon have that oath tested. His plan, such as it was straightforward to the point of simplicity. Advance in force, overwhelm the Mongols with numbers, crush them through sheer weight of men and metal. The Frankish knights on the right wing were eager, already spurring forward, impatient for glory and the rewards that came with it. The Turkic cavalry in the centre formed the main body, thousands of horsemen with composite bows and sabres. The Georgians held the left, professional and grim. Infantry filled the gaps between cavalry units. 80,000 men advancing. It looked unstoppable. It looked like destiny. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But before the main armies even engaged, before the great collision of cavalry masses, disaster struck from an unexpected direction, from within the Seljuk ranks themselves. One of the Seljuk nobles, young, ambitious, commanding about 20,000 men on the right wing, couldn't wait. Sources don't agree on his name, which is fitting because his decision would doom thousands of men whose names are also lost. He saw the Mongol line, saw what he thought was numerical inferiority, saw his chance for immortal glory, for songs and honours and wealth. Without orders, without coordination, without even basic tactical sense, he launched his own charge. 20,000 men broke ranks and surged forward, racing toward the Mongol right wing like a wave of steel and fury. The Frankish knights joined them, lances lowered, armor blazing in the sun, convinced that one good charge would scatter these horsemen like the Arab cavalry they'd faced in the Crusades. For a moment, watching from the main Seljuk line, it must have looked glorious. Cavalry thundering across the valley, dust rising behind them like smoke from a great fire, victory seemingly inevitable, triumph just minutes away. The Mongols did what they always did, what they'd done 1,000 times before, from the Danube to the Yellow River. They retreated. Not in panic, not in disorder, not like beaten men fleeing for their lives, in perfect formation, as coordinated as a flock of birds wheeling in the sky. The Mongol right wing wheeled and galloped away from the charging Seljuks. Their horses were fresh, carefully fed and watered that morning. Their riders were expert horsemen who'd learned to ride before they could walk. They opened the distance easily, staying just out of lance range, just beyond where the charging Seljuks could catch them. And as they rode, they twisted in their saddles and shot backward. The Parthian shot, the steppe archer's signature move, riding away from the enemy while putting arrows into them with devastating accuracy. It looks impossible. It requires years of practice. The Mongols made it look easy. The first Seljuk horseman to close the distance took arrows in the face, in the throat, in the gaps between armor plates where leather joints connected pieces of steel. Men toppled from saddles, dead before they hit the ground. Horses screamed and went down, thrashing, throwing riders who were trampled by those behind, bones breaking under iron-shod hooves. But the charge continued, momentum carrying it forward like a stone rolling downhill. The attackers convinced they had the Mongols on the run, convinced that victory was just ahead, just a few more yards. They charged deeper into the valley, farther from the main Seljuk line, farther from support, farther from any hope of retreat or rescue. And then the Mongol wings closed like the jaws of a trap. From the left and right, Mongol cavalry units that had been hidden in dead ground or held in reserve suddenly appeared, moving with mechanical precision. They wheeled inward, forming a horseshoe around the Seljuk attackers. The retreating Mongols stopped, turned on a copper coin, and rejoined the battle. In minutes, 20,000 Seljuks found themselves surrounded by Mongol horse archers firing from every direction, from ranges where Seljuk bows couldn't reach, but Mongol composite bows could kill with ease. It was a massacre dressed up as a battle. Arrows came in swarms, in clouds that literally darkened the air and made the sun dim. They fell like steel rain, punching through leather, finding seams in armor, dropping horses and men alike with mechanical efficiency. The Seljuks tried to rally, tried to form defensive circles, but cavalry can't hold ground under that kind of fire. The Mongol arrows didn't stop. Wave after wave, volley after volley. 60 arrows per warrior, and 30,000 warriors meant nearly 2 million arrows potentially available. They didn't need all of them, not even close. Men broke, ran, died running. The Frankish knights tried to charge out of the trap, tried to do what they did best, close with the enemy and fight hand to hand where their armor and training would give them advantage. Their plate armor saved some from arrows, deflecting shots that would have killed lighter armored men, but the Mongols adjusted tactics on the fly, adapting like water flowing around obstacles. Shoot the horses, not the riders. Once the knights were unhorsed, they were just men in metal shells, exhausted by heat and weight, stumbling around in 100-pound suits of armor under the Anatolian sun. Easy prey for light cavalry to swarm and finish with sabres and axes. It took less than 2 hours. By mid-morning, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and heat beginning to kill men as surely as weapons, 20,000 Seljuk soldiers were dead, captured, or fleeing in blind panic. 3,000 bodies littered that section of valley, already bloating in the heat, turning black, attracting flies in clouds so thick they looked like smoke. The survivors fled in all directions, panicked and broken, throwing away weapons and armor to run faster, thinking only of escape. And the main Seljuk army, still in formation perhaps 2 miles away, had watched it happen, had stood paralyzed while a quarter of their force was systematically destroyed. The psychological impact was devastating, crushing, absolute. These weren't peasant levies who'd been slaughtered. These were nobles, knights, trained cavalry, the best troops, the most experienced warriors. Gone in 2 hours. Khosrow should have retreated right then, should have withdrawn to Sivas immediately, regrouped behind walls, adopted the defensive strategy his smart generals had advocated from the start. But retreating after that disaster would look like panic, would look like defeat, would destroy morale completely, turn an army into a mob. So he ordered the advance to continue, the worst decision possible in that moment. The main Seljuk army trudged forward, and the Mongols waited for them like patient predators. When the lines finally closed, when the 2 main armies actually engaged, the battle entered a new phase, different in character, but no less brutal. This was closer-range fighting, too tight for the Mongols' usual mobility advantage, too chaotic for sophisticated tactics. The Seljuk infantry pushed forward with spears and shields, finally useful after hours of watching cavalry fight. The Turkic cavalry in the centre clashed with Mongol heavy cavalry in swirling melees of sabre and lance and pure murderous rage. For hours, the battle was genuinely contested, ebbing and flowing, neither side gaining decisive advantage. The Georgian contingent on the Seljuk left distinguished themselves with courage that deserved better fate. These were disciplined, professional soldiers, veterans of border wars and dynastic struggles. They fought like demons, refusing to break, holding their ground against repeated Mongol attacks. They drove back multiple charges, held their formation, even counterattacked, and pushed the Mongol left wing backward. For a brief moment, for a shining instant, it seemed like the battle might turn, like the Georgians might punch through and roll up the Mongol line. But the Mongols had reserves, fresh troops rotating into the line. This was professional warfare, not heroic, but ruthlessly efficient. While the Georgians tired, while their horses flagged, while their arrows ran low, fresh Mongol units relieved exhausted ones. The Seljuks had no such rotation system, no such organization. Their men fought until they dropped. And as the afternoon wore on, as the sun climbed to its zenith, and heat became another enemy more deadly than swords, Seljuk cohesion began to fracture like sun-baked clay. The smell of blood was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste, coppery and hot, mixed with the stench of opened bowels and the sweet rot of bodies already cooking in their armor. Gases building up until corpses swelled grotesquely. Flies appeared in clouds so thick they sounded like wind, covering wounds, drinking blood, spreading disease. The ground grew slippery with gore, horses losing footing in mud made from earth and blood. Wounded men cried for water, for mercy, for their mothers in a dozen languages. The noise was constant and maddening. Metal on metal, screams of pain and rage, horses shrieking with wounds, commanders shouting orders no one could hear through the chaos. And then came the betrayals that finished what the Mongols had started. The Turkmen cavalry contingents, those tribal warriors who'd always been semi-autonomous, who'd never fully accepted Seljuk authority, who remembered when they'd been independent, started defecting. In ones and twos at first, then in whole units of hundreds, they rode across to the Mongol lines with hands raised in surrender or supplication. These Turkmen felt kinship with the Mongols, both peoples originating from the Central Asian steppes, both speaking related Turkic languages, both living by nomadic traditions that urban Seljuks had abandoned generations ago. The urban Seljuks had always looked down on them as half-civilized, barely better than bandits. Now they switched sides and took Seljuk military secrets with them. Each defection opened gaps in the Seljuk line. Each gap became a point for Mongol attacks to pour through like water through a cracking dam. The Khwarezmian mercenaries, those refugees who'd fled earlier Mongol conquests in Central Asia, who'd already lost everything once to these same enemies, knew exactly what fate awaited them if they were captured. They'd seen what the Mongols did to survivors of broken armies. They fled en masse, riding for the mountains, abandoning the battle entirely, thinking only of survival. The Seljuk center began to crumble. Slowly at first, then faster, then all at once. Kaikhosrau's personal guard, perhaps 2,000 heavy cavalry sworn to protect their sultan with their lives, tried to stem the collapse. They formed around the sultan's banner, a magnificent silk standard that had flown over victories for generations, and prepared to make a stand. They were brave men. Their courage was irrelevant. Mongol horse archers swarmed them, shooting from just out of sword range, maintaining distance with expert horsemanship. Men fell from saddles like fruit from shaken trees, bodies piling up around the banner. The standard itself took so many arrows it looked like a porcupine, so heavy with shafts that it drooped. The standard-bearer died, then his replacement, then the next man, until no one would take the banner and it fell into the dust. Someone, probably one of his remaining generals, someone with enough sense to see the disaster, grabbed Kaikhosru's bridle and shouted something urgent. The exact words are lost to history, but the meaning was clear. "We have to run. Now. Right now, or you'll die here." The Sultan's nerve broke. Whatever courage or pride had brought him to this battlefield evaporated like water on hot stone. He wheeled his horse and galloped toward the rear, towards safety, towards survival. His personal guard tried to follow, to shield his retreat with their bodies, but most were cut down within minutes. Mongol cavalry pursued, arrows flying, sabres flashing. Men died protecting a sultan who was already gone. Kaikhosru himself made it out of the killing zone by pure luck. A horse that didn't stumble, a gap in the Mongol line, arrows that missed by inches. He rode hard for Sivas, didn't stop at Sivas, kept riding through the night, rode all the way to Konya, kept riding to Antalya on the coast, as far from the Mongols as Anatolia allowed. He'd survive, his empire wouldn't. The Seljuk army collapsed like a house of cards, like a dam breaking, like any structure when its foundation fails. Without the Sultan's banner to rally around, without leadership, without hope, 80,000 men became a mob of individuals trying desperately not to die. Some units held together and retreated in good order. The Georgians managed this through pure discipline, fighting their way out in a withdrawal that the Mongols noted with professional respect. Most just ran, throwing away weapons and armor, thinking only of escape. The Mongols pursued, but carefully. Baiju had fought enough battles to know that running down a routed army could be more dangerous than the battle itself. Scattered soldiers could regroup, ambushes could be laid, terrain could favor defenders, exhausted cavalry could be vulnerable. As darkness fell, as shadows lengthened across the valley of death, he called off the pursuit. Let them run. Let them carry stories of what happened here. Let terror do the work that arrows had started. Night settled over Köse Dağ. The battle was over. The killing continued. The wounded lay where they'd fallen, scattered across miles of valley floor like discarded dolls. They cried out in a dozen languages, each man calling for help that would never come. Some begged for water, throats raw from screaming and dust. Some called names of friends or relatives, hoping someone would find them. Some just moaned, animal sounds of pain that had no words, no meaning beyond suffering. As temperatures dropped from day's heat to night's chill, many simply died of shock and exposure, their bodies giving up after holding together through battle. Scavengers appeared, locals from nearby villages, camp followers from both armies, anyone brave or desperate enough to venture onto the field. They moved among the bodies, stripping armor, taking jewelry, rifling through pockets and pouches for coins or valuables. They finished off men too wounded to resist. Mercy killings that weren't particularly merciful, but at least ended suffering. They loaded corpses onto carts to be buried, or left them for the wolves and dogs if no one paid for proper disposal. The moon rose over a landscape transformed into hell. Silver light painting everything in shades of grey that hid the worst of the blood. Bodies sprawled everywhere, thousands upon thousands, already starting to swell in the heat. Horses lay dead or dying, their enormous bulk making them landmarks in the carnage. Near the grey stallion, a scavenger might say, directing another to particularly rich pickings. Broken weapons littered the ground, making walking treacherous. Blood soaked into the earth until the dirt turned to reddish mud that would stain boots and feet for weeks. Flies swarmed in clouds, so thick they sounded like wind, covering wounds, laying eggs in dead flesh, beginning the process that would reduce men to bones. Baiju's men set up camp just beyond the battlefield, far enough to avoid the worst of the smell, but close enough to guard against counterattack. They'd taken losses. Estimates suggest 2,000 to 3,000 dead or wounded. But nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would prevent them from continuing operations. They'd destroyed an army 3 times their size. They'd shattered the most powerful state in Anatolia. Tomorrow, they'd begin following up on their victory, pursuing the Sultan, securing their conquest, teaching the lesson they'd come to teach. Tonight, they rested, professional soldiers who'd done their jobs and done them well. In the Seljuk camp, or what remained of it, survivors stumbled in throughout the night. Men who'd run in all directions and somehow found their way back through darkness and terror. Units that had managed to retreat intact, their numbers decimated, but their organization maintained. Deserters hoping to slip away before anyone noticed them missing, before questions could be asked. The atmosphere was pure shock, collective trauma on a scale that broke men's minds as surely as the battle had broken their army. How had this happened? 80,000 men had marched out that morning. Maybe 30,000 returned, and that's a generous estimate. The rest were dead, captured, or fleeing through the mountains. Khusro reached Sivas, then kept running. He rode all the way to Konya, the capital, then to Antalya on the coast, as far from the Mongols as Anatolia allowed. His army was destroyed, his reputation was shattered, his empire was dying, bleeding out from a wound inflicted in a single afternoon. And in the mountains, in the beyliks and principalities that had contributed troops to the disaster, men drew their own conclusions. The Seljuk Sultanate was finished. The Mongols were unstoppable. The old order was dead. What came next was anyone's guess. But in that uncertainty, in that chaos, in that complete collapse of authority, opportunity lurked for men ambitious enough and ruthless enough to seize it. The bodies at Köse Dağ told a story in death that the living struggled to articulate. A narrative written in corpses and broken weapons. When officials finally organized burial details days after the battle, and it took days because no one wanted to approach the field while Mongol patrols still ranged nearby, they counted 20,000 Seljuk dead, and that was a conservative estimate based on bodies they could identify. Many more had been burned in mass pyres, or had crawled away to die in the mountains where they'd never be found, or had been dragged off by wolves and wild dogs that grew fat that summer. Some historians suggest the true death toll approached 30,000. For context, that's roughly the same number of men who fought at Waterloo 6 centuries later. This wasn't a skirmish. This wasn't even a regular battle. This was industrial-scale slaughter, a human disaster on a level that changed demographics. The Mongol losses, by contrast, were minimal. Maybe 2,000 killed, another 1,000 wounded, seriously enough to remove them from further campaigning. A remarkably efficient exchange rate for ancient warfare. Among the Mongol dead were mostly auxiliaries, Armenians and Georgians who'd been pressed into service and had absorbed the brunt of the Seljuk counterattacks. Expendable troops whose deaths preserved Mongol core strength. The core Mongol cavalry had come through largely intact, capable of continuing operations immediately. Bodies were identified by whatever marks distinguished them in life. A particular sword hilt, known to belong to a certain noble, found clutched in a dead hand. Armour with family crests, though the men inside were often unrecognizable from wounds. Jewellery, Rings, necklaces, bracelets that relatives could identify. Sometimes just teeth. A gap in the smile that a wife or brother would recognize, a personal detail that survived when faces didn't. The Frankish knights, encased in their full-plate armor, were easiest to identify, but hardest to bury. It took multiple men to carry one armored corpse, dead weight made worse by metal. Many were simply left where they'd fallen, their armor too valuable to waste on graves, but too heavy to strip efficiently in the summer heat. Mass graves were dug east of the pass, pits 20 feet deep and 100 feet long. Workers threw bodies in without much ceremony, covering them with quicklime to control disease and smell. No markers, no monuments, no prayers beyond the hasty blessings of surviving clerics who feared the ghosts of the unburied dead. Just holes in the ground that would puzzle archaeologists centuries later when they found concentrations of human remains mixed with corroded metal and thousands of arrowheads. Khosrow's humiliation was only beginning, the first payment on a debt that would take decades to fully extract. When his delegation finally caught up with Baiju's advancing army near Sivas, the Mongols were methodically occupying major cities, meeting no resistance. The terms they negotiated were crushingly harsh. The Sultanate would pay annual tribute, massive quantities of gold, silk, camels, sheep, horses, and slaves. The amounts would bankrupt the treasury, requiring special taxes that would make the Sultan hated by his own people. Half of the Sultanate's territory, the entire eastern half, would be occupied by Mongol garrisons. Mongol officials, darugachi, would be stationed in every major city to oversee tax collection, enforce compliance, report any hint of rebellion. The Sultan himself would remain in power, but only as a puppet, a figurehead useful for maintaining local administration. Real authority belonged to the Mongols now. Coins minted in the years after Köse Dağ tell the story without words, numismatic evidence of humiliation. Earlier Seljuk coins proudly proclaimed the Sultan's name and titles: the Just King, Defender of the Faith, Sultan of Rum. Post-1243 coins carried vague, submissive legends: sovereignty belongs to God, or the Just Sultan, without naming which sultan. No boasts, no claims of power, just prayers and platitudes from a dynasty that had been emasculated in a single afternoon. The Mongols weren't interested in directly ruling Anatolia. They had an empire stretching from Korea to Poland, dozens of conquered territories, and Anatolia was just one more region to be managed. They installed garrisons near major cities like Ankara, collected tribute, and otherwise let local administration continue. But that light-touch occupation was almost worse than direct conquest. It created a power vacuum, a political situation where authority was unclear and therefore contestable. The Seljuk sultans had authority on paper, but no real power to enforce decisions. The Mongols had power, but no interest in actually governing day-to-day affairs. Into that vacuum stepped ambitious men who saw opportunity in chaos. Throughout the 1240s and 1250s, local strongmen began carving out their own territories, building their own power bases. These beyliks, principalities, were technically still part of the Seljuk Sultanate, paying lip service to the Sultan in Konya, but in practice they were independent. Little kingdoms with their own armies, their own courts, their own ambitions. A powerful Atabeg here, a frontier warlord there, each building their own power base in the rubble of Seljuk authority. One of these beyliks deserves our attention because it would change everything, though no one knew it at the time. Near a town called Söğüt, on the frontier between Seljuk Anatolia and the Byzantine Empire's remaining territories in the west, a man named Ertuğrul led a small tribal group. His holdings were modest, a few villages, some grazing land for his people's flocks. His followers numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. He was nobody important, just another minor warlord in a land full of them. In the chaos after Köse Dağ, he'd managed to secure his position, probably by offering military service to whoever controlled the region at the moment, probably by raiding Byzantine territories and bringing back enough loot to reward his followers. Ertuğrul had a son named Osman. We don't know much about Osman's early years. The sources are maddeningly vague, written long after the fact, mixing legend with history in ways that make historians tear their hair out. But we know he grew up in that post-Köse Dağ world of fragmentation and opportunity. He grew up watching the Seljuk Sultanate disintegrate in slow motion. He grew up on the Byzantine frontier, where aggressive Ghazis, frontier warriors fighting for Islam, could raid weakened Christian territories and build power through conquest. He grew up in a world where the old rules didn't apply anymore, where ambition and military skill mattered more than noble birth or royal favour. The Byzantines themselves were in no position to resist anyone. They'd been shattered by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, briefly erased from existence when Crusaders conquered Constantinople itself, and only recently restored to power. They barely controlled territory beyond their capital's walls. Anatolia, which they'd lost to the Seljuks back in 1071, was now a patchwork of competing Turkish principalities. The Byzantines couldn't project power into that chaos, even if they'd wanted to, which they didn't because they had enough problems in Europe. Perfect conditions, in other words, for an ambitious warlord to rise from nothing to something. To build a beylik into an emirate into a sultanate into an empire. Throughout the 1250s and 1260s, the Seljuk Sultanate existed in name only, a zombie state animated by Mongol puppetry. Different sultans claimed the throne in Konya. The Mongols executed some, installed others, switched them out when convenient. In 1277, the Mamluks from Egypt briefly invaded, trying to free Anatolia from Mongol control. They won a battle, occupied some territory, then retreated when Mongol reinforcements arrived. The political situation was utterly chaotic, completely unpredictable, perfect for opportunists. Then, in 1335, the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that ruled Persia and theoretically controlled Anatolia, collapsed in civil war. The dynasty fragmented, rival claimants fought each other, central authority disappeared. Suddenly, the Mongol garrisons in Anatolia withdrew. The tribute stopped being collected. The overlords were gone. Anatolia was free from Mongol control, but free just meant completely fragmented. The Seljuk Sultanate ended not with a dramatic fall, but with a whimper. The last sultan vanished from historical records sometime in the early 1300s, and nobody even bothered recording exactly when or how the dynasty died. The capital, Konya, was taken by the Karamanid Turkmens in 1328. That was it. End of an empire that had ruled for 2 centuries. What replaced it? A dozen competing beyliks, each claiming legitimacy, each fighting the others, none strong enough to reunify Anatolia under their control. One of them, on the Byzantine frontier near Soğut, was led by Osman, Ertuğrul's son. His beylik was small, poor, seemingly insignificant compared to more established principalities inland. He ruled maybe a few thousand people. He controlled maybe a few hundred square miles. Nothing impressive, nothing that suggested future greatness. Within a century, His descendants would conquer Constantinople and terrify Europe. Within 2 centuries, they'd rule an empire stretching from Algeria to Iraq, from Hungary to Yemen. Within 4 centuries, they'd be besieging Vienna and threatening the heart of Christian Europe. The Mongols had destroyed the Seljuk order at Köse Dağ. They had imposed their authority. They had achieved every military objective they'd set. They had no idea, could not have had any idea, that they'd just created the conditions for the Ottoman Empire to be born from the rubble. History has a twisted sense of humour, an ironic sensibility that would make even the darkest satirist pause. The Mongols came to Anatolia to impose order. They wanted to integrate the region into their vast empire, to ensure tribute flowed properly, to establish a hierarchy with themselves at the top and everyone else beneath them, paying, obeying, submitting. They succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. They broke the Seljuks so thoroughly that Anatolia never had a centralized power again. Not for a century, not until the Ottomans reunified the region through conquest. And that breaking, that complete destruction of order, created exactly the conditions necessary for dynamic, aggressive, hungry beyliks to flourish like flowers growing in bombed-out ruins. Think about it. Before Köse Dağ, the Seljuk Sultanate was stable, centralized, controlled. Small principalities couldn't grow because the Sultan's authority kept them in check, because there was a mechanism for enforcing hierarchy, because the state functioned. After Köse Dağ, that central authority evaporated like water in the desert sun. Suddenly, ambitious warlords had room to expand, to innovate, to build power without a strong sultan shutting them down. The beyliks that emerged in the 1250s and after were laboratories of political and military experimentation, testing new ideas about governance and warfare. Osman's beylik was perfectly positioned for success, positioned by accident, by geography, by historical forces no one controlled. On the Byzantine frontier, where aggressive raids could yield land and loot and glory, far enough from major Mongol garrisons that he had autonomy and freedom of action, close enough to collapsing Byzantine territories that expansion was possible, even easy. He and his successors spent decades building a war machine, absorbing other beyliks through conquest and alliance, conquering Byzantine cities one by one. By 1326, they'd taken Bursa, making it their capital. By 1337, Nicaea, the city where Christian councils had once defined orthodoxy, fell to Turkish warriors. By the 1350s, they'd crossed into Europe and were eating the Byzantine Empire alive from both sides, Asian and European, simultaneously. The supreme irony? In 1402, history repeated itself with eerie precision. The Ottomans, by then a major regional power controlling much of Anatolia and the Balkans, faced their own Mongol invasion, their own existential crisis. Timur, Tamerlane, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, who'd rebuilt a Mongol empire in Central Asia, invaded Anatolia with another massive army. Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, called the Thunderbolt, rode out to meet him near Ankara with 85,000 men. Sound familiar? The numbers, the location, the hubris, all eerily similar to Kai Khosrow's fatal decision 159 years earlier. At the Battle of Ankara, on July 28, 1402, Timur crushed the Ottoman army through the exact same tactics the Mongols had used at Köse Dağ. Encirclement, horse archers, defections from Turkmen contingents who felt kinship with their Central Asian cousins. Bayezid was captured, the only Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner, and died in captivity. The Ottoman Empire fell into civil war, the Ottoman interregnum. 11 years of brothers fighting brothers, principalities breaking away, the empire fragmenting into chaos. It looked exactly like what had happened to the Seljuks. The pattern was repeating. The Mongols had destroyed another Turkic empire. History was a circle. But here's the crucial difference, the fork in the road. The Ottomans survived. Timur died in 1405 while preparing to invade China. His empire collapsed within a generation, fragmented into squabbling successor states. Meanwhile, the Ottomans pulled themselves back together under Mehmed I by 1413. They learned from their near-death experience. They centralized harder. They rebuilt faster. They came back stronger, more determined, more efficient. By 1453, they conquered Constantinople, the prize the Seljuks had never managed to take, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years. By 1529, Ottoman armies were besieging Vienna, threatening the heart of Europe, making Christian kings tremble. The empire the Mongols had accidentally created by destroying the Seljuks became one of history's great powers, lasting until 1922, until the modern era. The philosophical meaning here cuts deep, reveals something profound about historical processes. Great empires often create their own successors through destruction. Rome's fall created the medieval kingdoms that would eventually become modern European states. The Mongol destruction of the Islamic Middle East's old order, Baghdad fell in 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate ending in rivers of blood and burning libraries, created space for new Islamic powers to emerge. The Ottomans were the greatest of these successor states, building something larger and longer lasting than what the Mongols had broken, proving that destruction can be creative. Conquest contains the seeds of its own replacement. The conquerors plant those seeds unknowingly, can't help planting them because destruction creates vacuums, and vacuums demand filling. The Mongols came to dominate, to establish eternal order, to build an empire that would last forever. But empires are like forest fires. Sometimes they clear ground for greater trees to grow, burn away the old growth so new forests can emerge stronger. Today, if you visit Köse Dağ, you won't find much. Turkish farmers plough fields where 80,000 men gathered in June 1243. There are no monuments, no plaques explaining what happened, no tourist infrastructure. Most visitors to Turkey have never heard of the place. The local villagers might know the name of the pass, might know something important happened there centuries ago, but the details have faded into folklore and legend. History forgot the battle that changed everything, the turning point that no one recognized as a turning point until centuries later. But the consequence lives on, echoes through centuries, shapes the world we inhabit. Modern Turkey exists partly because of what happened at Köse Dağ. The Balkans' complicated history, the ethnic tensions, the religious divisions, the cultural complexity, all of it traces back partly to that June morning when the Seljuks shattered and left a vacuum that Osman's descendants filled. European identity itself was shaped by centuries of Ottoman pressure, the threat from the east that forged alliances and defined borders and created the concept of Europe as a unified civilization defending itself. The Mongols destroyed the Seljuks. They established Mongol supremacy over Anatolia. They achieved every objective they'd set out to accomplish. They won completely, definitively, overwhelmingly. And in doing so, they planted seeds they'd never intended to sow. They cleared space. They created chaos. They broke the old order so completely that something new could grow in the ruins. like plants pushing through concrete. Centuries later, that something new would be an Ottoman army standing at the walls of Constantinople in 1453, finally achieving what the Seljuks never could, what the Mongols never even attempted. Centuries after that, Ottoman power would reach its zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent, controlling 3 continents, reshaping the medieval world, creating a legacy that would last into the modern era. All because 30,000 Mongol cavalry won a battle in an Anatolian mountain pass on a hot June day in 1243 and never realized what they'd set in motion. All because destruction creates opportunity. All because empires that seem permanent are actually just temporary arrangements waiting for the next accident of history. They came to impose order. They created opportunity. They won the battle. They lost the future. The greatest empires aren't always built by visionaries with master plans and grand strategies. Sometimes they're born from chaos, from the ashes of someone else's victory, from accidents of history that nobody could have predicted or controlled. The Ottomans rose because the Mongols destroyed the Seljuks. The destroyers created the successors. The conquerors gave birth to the conquered, who would become greater than the conquerors ever were. That's the final irony of Köse Dağ, the lesson written in blood and bones. The Mongols won, but in winning, they lost. In destroying order, they created the conditions for new order. In breaking an empire, they forged the weapon that would build a greater one. Centuries later, when Ottoman sultans sat in Constantinople, ruling territories the Mongols had conquered and lost, did they remember Köse Dağ? Did they understand that their empire existed because of a battle their ancestors might not have even fought? Did they see the irony? Probably not. Empires rarely understand their own origins. History's great ironies are usually only visible in retrospect, from the future looking back. But we can see it now. We can trace the line from destruction to creation, from Mongol victory to Ottoman rise, from chaos to order, to new chaos, to new order. The battle nobody remembers created the empire everybody knows. And that might be the greatest irony of all.